The Russian Civil War was a conflict of unprecedented brutality, a war where allegiances shifted like sand, and yesterday's enemy could become tomorrow's comrade in arms. Between 1918 and 1922, the territories of the former Russian Empire became a vast killing ground where Reds fought Whites, Whites fought Greens, and entire populations were caught in the crossfire of competing visions for Russia's future. But amid the chaos and bloodshed, one phenomenon stands out as particularly striking: the mass defection of white officers to the Bolshevik cause. These were men trained in the academies of Imperial Russia, officers who had sworn oaths to the Tsar, who had fought in the Great War, and who initially took up arms against the revolutionary government. Yet thousands upon thousands of them would cross the lines, abandon their former comrades, and offer their services to the very regime they had sought to destroy. What happened to these men? The answer reveals not just individual fates, but the ruthless pragmatism of the Soviet system and the terrible price of survival in a revolutionary state. The defection of white officers to the Red Army was not an isolated occurrence, but a widespread pattern that characterized the entire Civil War period. This was an era when changing sides was almost commonplace, when military men calculated their chances of survival with cold precision, and when ideological commitment often took second place to the simple desire to remain alive. Some officers changed uniforms not once, but multiple times, reading the shifting fortunes of war like weather vanes spinning in a storm. The phenomenon was so common that it ceased to shock contemporaries. In the fluid, anarchic conditions of the Civil War, loyalty became a commodity to be traded, and principles were luxuries that many could not afford. The Bolsheviks faced a critical problem from the moment they seized power. They had revolutionaries in abundance, men and women committed to the cause with fervor and dedication. What they lacked were professional military officers capable of organizing, training, and leading armies in conventional warfare. The old imperial army had dissolved in the chaos of revolution, and while the Bolsheviks had political commissars who could ensure ideological purity, they desperately needed officers who understood tactics, logistics, and military organization. The Red Army in its early years was a revolutionary force strong on enthusiasm but dangerously weak on military expertise. This shortage of command personnel became acute as the Civil War intensified, and multiple white armies, foreign interventionist forces, and nationalist movements threatened the Bolshevik regime from all directions. The solution was as pragmatic as it was ideologically uncomfortable. The Bolsheviks would recruit their enemies. White officers who defected to the Soviet side were accepted with remarkable eagerness, their former allegiances overlooked, in the desperate need for military competence. The numbers were staggering. Roughly tens of thousands of former imperial officers and white commanders eventually made their way into Red Army ranks. This was not a trickle of isolated defectors, but a flood of military professionals who brought with them the knowledge and experience that the Bolsheviks so desperately required. The recruitment was systematic and deliberate. The Bolsheviks established procedures for accepting defectors, vetting them to some degree, and then deploying them where their skills could be most effectively utilized. The motivations for defection were complex and varied from man to man. Some officers were driven by practical considerations. By 1919 and 1920, the tide of the Civil War was turning decisively in favor of the Bolsheviks. White armies that had once seemed poised to crush the revolution were now in retreat, their supply lines collapsing, their political unity fracturing, and their foreign support evaporating. For an officer watching his cause crumble, defection offered a path to survival, and perhaps even continued military service. Others were motivated by a form of Russian patriotism that transcended the ideological divide between red and white. These men had served the Russian Empire, and when that empire fell, their loyalty transferred not to any particular political faction, but to Russia itself as a concept and a territory. This patriotic motivation became especially important during the Soviet-Polish War of 1919 to 1920. When Poland, newly independent and ambitious, invaded Soviet territory and pushed deep into Ukraine and Belarus, the Bolsheviks made a calculated appeal to Russian nationalist sentiment. The war was framed not as a defense of Bolshevism, but as a defense of Russian lands against foreign invasion. For white officers who had fought in the Great War, who had seen the German and Austro-Hungarian empires carve away Russian territory, the Polish advance represented another humiliation, another loss of Russian soil. The Bolsheviks actively recruited white officers for this conflict, counting on their patriotic feelings to overcome their ideological objections to Soviet power. The strategy worked. White officers joined the Red Army in significant numbers during this period, bringing their military expertise to bear against what they perceived as a foreign threat to the Russian motherland. Once accepted into the Red Army, these former white officers were deployed in various capacities depending on their skills and the degree of trust the Bolsheviks were willing to extend. Some were assigned to training duties, tasked with educating the new generation of Soviet commanders in the military arts. These positions were relatively safe, keeping the former white officers away from the front lines where they might defect back to their original side or sabotage operations. In military academies and training centers, they taught tactics, strategy, logistics, and the technical aspects of warfare to young Bolsheviks who had revolutionary zeal but little formal military education. This transfer of knowledge was crucial in professionalizing the Red Army and transforming it from a revolutionary militia into a modern fighting force. Others were sent directly to the front lines, given command positions, and expected to fight for their new masters. The Bolsheviks were taking a calculated risk with these assignments. But the shortage of competent officers left them little choice. Political commissars were attached to military units, partly to ensure that these former enemies did not betray the revolution, but the system was imperfect and relied heavily on the self-interest of the defectors themselves. For many of these officers, the best guarantee of survival was to prove their worth to the Bolsheviks through military success. Some did exactly that, forging remarkable careers in the Red Army that would have been unthinkable just years earlier when they wore the uniform of the White Forces. The case of Nikolai Kokurin exemplifies the extraordinary possibilities available to defectors who proved their loyalty and competence. Kokurin had been an officer in the Imperial Russian Army, trained in the military traditions of the old regime. Yet after defecting to the Bolsheviks, he rose rapidly through the ranks of the Red Army. His military skill and organizational abilities were recognized and rewarded. He was promoted to command the Third Army, one of the major formations of the Red Army during the Civil War. This was not a minor or symbolic position, but a genuine command of thousands of men with real operational responsibilities. Kokurin's success demonstrated that the Bolsheviks were willing to overlook political background when military necessity demanded it. His career also showed other wavering white officers that defection could lead not just to survival, but to advancement and prestige. Kokurin was far from alone. Other former white officers achieved significant positions in the Red Army during and immediately after the Civil War. They commanded divisions, organized logistics, planned operations, and contributed materially to the Bolshevik victory. For a brief period, it seemed that the Soviet system might genuinely integrate these former enemies. that military professionalism might transcend the ideological hatreds of the Civil War. The Bolsheviks needed these men, and the men needed the Bolsheviks. It was a marriage of convenience, but it appeared to be working. The end of the Civil War in 1922 brought a dramatic shift in circumstances. With the White armies defeated, the foreign interventionists withdrawn, and the Bolshevik regime secure, the massive Red Army that had been built up during the conflict was no longer necessary. The Soviet state, economically devastated by years of war, revolution, and civil strife, could not afford to maintain millions of men under arms. A massive demobilization began, reducing the Red Army to a fraction of its wartime strength. In this process of reduction, the former white officers were the first to be dismissed. The pragmatic acceptance that had characterized the Civil War years evaporated now that the emergency had passed. These men were no longer indispensable, and their political backgrounds made them suspect in a state increasingly concerned with ideological purity and internal security. The demobilization was swift and thorough. Thousands of former white officers who had served the Bolsheviks during the Civil War suddenly found themselves without positions, without employment, and without the protection that military service had provided. Some managed to find work in civilian life, disappearing into the vast Soviet bureaucracy or taking up technical positions where their education and skills were valuable. Others were not so fortunate, struggling to survive in a society that viewed them with suspicion despite their service to the revolution. The Soviet state kept records, and the fact that someone had once served in the White armies was never forgotten, even if they had later defected and fought for the Reds. A minority of former white officers managed to remain in the Red Army after the demobilization. These were men whose skills were deemed too valuable to lose, whose loyalty had been demonstrated beyond doubt, or who had powerful patrons within the Soviet military hierarchy. For these fortunate few, military careers continued into the 1920s and beyond. Some rose to command corps and divisions, achieving ranks that would have been extraordinary in the old Imperial Army. Their success stories were held up as examples of the Soviet system's ability to integrate former class enemies, proof that loyalty to the revolution mattered more than social origin or past allegiances. Two names stand out as the most spectacular examples of former white officers who not only survived, but thrived in the Soviet military system. Ivan Bagramyan and Leonid Govorov both had complex backgrounds that included service in the Imperial Russian Army, and both would eventually achieve the highest military rank in the Soviet Union, Marshal of the Soviet Union. Bagramyan, an Armenian from the Caucasus, had served in the Imperial Cavalry and then in the Red Army during the Civil War. His military talents were undeniable, and he survived the purges of the 1930s to become one of the most important Soviet commanders during the Great Patriotic War. He commanded fronts, planned major operations, and was instrumental in the liberation of the Baltic states and the invasion of East Prussia. His elevation to Marshal in 1955 was recognition of decades of loyal service and military excellence. Govorov's path was even more remarkable given his background. He had fought in the White armies during the Civil War before defecting to the Bolsheviks. This was precisely the kind of history that could doom a man during the purges. Yet Govorov not only survived, but prospered. His technical expertise in artillery was recognized early, and he became one of the Red Army's leading specialists in this crucial branch of warfare. During the Great Patriotic War, he commanded the Leningrad Front during the siege, one of the most difficult and important commands in the entire Soviet military. His successful defense of the city and eventual breaking of the siege made him a hero. He was promoted to Marshal of the Soviet Union in 1944, an extraordinary achievement for someone who had once taken up arms against the Bolsheviks. These success stories, however, were exceptional. For every Bagramyan or a Govorov, there were hundreds of former white officers whose fates were far darker. The 1930s brought a wave of paranoia and repression to the Soviet Union that would consume millions of lives. The Great Terror, as it came to be known, targeted every segment of Soviet society, but certain groups were particularly vulnerable. Former white officers, even those who had served the Bolsheviks loyally for over a decade, were obvious targets for suspicion. Their past allegiances made them perfect scapegoats in a system obsessed with uncovering hidden enemies and conspiracies. The purges began in earnest in the early 1930s. In 1930 and 1931, Soviet security services conducted a massive operation targeting former imperial officers and White Army veterans who had joined the Red Army. This operation was codenamed the Spring Case, a bureaucratic designation that concealed the human tragedy it represented. Hundreds of former white officers were arrested in coordinated sweeps. The charges were predictable: espionage, sabotage, participation in counter-revolutionary conspiracies, and planning to overthrow the Soviet government. The evidence was typically fabricated or extracted through torture. Show trials were held for some of the more prominent cases, while others were processed in secret by troikas and special tribunals that offered no real opportunity for defense. The executions began almost immediately after the arrests. Former officers who had commanded Red Army units during the Civil War, who had trained Soviet cadets, who had fought against the Poles and other enemies of the Bolshevik state, were now shot as traitors and spies. The logic was circular and inescapable. Their service in the White Armies proved they were enemies of the revolution. Their subsequent service in the Red Army proved they were infiltrators and saboteurs. No amount of loyal service could erase the original sin of having opposed the Bolsheviks. The Spring Case claimed hundreds of victims, but it was only the beginning. The Great Terror of 1937 and 1938 dwarfed the earlier purges in scale and intensity. The Red Army was decimated by arrests and executions. Marshals, generals, admirals, and officers of every rank were caught up in the machinery of repression. Former white officers who had somehow survived the earlier purges now found themselves arrested en masse. The charges were the same, the trials equally farcical, and the outcomes predetermined. Execution or lengthy sentences in the Gulag awaited almost all of them. The Soviet security apparatus, the NKVD, worked with ruthless efficiency, processing thousands of cases and sending thousands of men to their deaths. The impact on the Red Army was catastrophic. By the time the Great Terror subsided in late 1938, the Soviet military had lost a staggering proportion of its experienced officer corps. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 30 and 50,000 officers were arrested, and a large percentage of these were executed. Among the victims were virtually all of the remaining former white officers who had defected during the Civil War. Men like Bagramyan and Govorov survived through a combination of luck, patronage, and perhaps the recognition that their technical skills were too valuable to waste. But they were rare exceptions. The vast majority of their comrades, who had made the same journey from white to red, perished in the purges. The irony was bitter and absolute. These men had defected to save their lives, to escape the collapsing white cause and find a place in the new Soviet order. Many had served loyally for nearly 2 decades, had trained the next generation of Soviet officers, had fought in the defense of Soviet territory, and had integrated themselves into the military hierarchy. Yet their past could never be erased or forgiven. In the paranoid logic of Stalinism, their very existence was proof of potential treachery. The fact that they had changed sides once meant they could change sides again. The fact that they had military training from the old regime meant they were connected to the old order and its values. No amount of service or sacrifice could overcome these suspicions. The purges of former white officers revealed the fundamental nature of the Stalinist system. It was a regime that could be ruthlessly pragmatic when necessity demanded, accepting former enemies and utilizing their skills without hesitation. But it was also a regime incapable of genuine forgiveness or trust, one that maintained meticulous records of past transgressions and eventually used those records to destroy the very people it had once welcomed. The defectors had made a rational calculation during the Civil War, choosing the side that seemed most likely to win and most likely to spare their lives. For a time, that calculation appeared correct. But the Soviet system was not a rational one, at least not in any conventional sense. It operated according to its own internal logic, one in which past associations were permanent marks of suspicion and in which no one was ever truly safe. The fate of the white officers who defected to the Soviets serves as a microcosm of the broader Soviet experience. It demonstrates how the revolution consumed not just its enemies, but also those who tried to make peace with it. It shows how the Soviet state could be flexible and accommodating when weak, but became rigid and murderous when secure. It reveals the ultimate futility of trying to escape political categorization in a totalitarian system. These officers thought they could leave their white past behind, that their service to the Bolsheviks would create a new identity and a new future. They were wrong. In the Soviet Union, the past was never past. It was always present, always available to be weaponized against those who carried it. The story also illuminates the particular tragedy of the military professionals caught between collapsing empires and rising totalitarian states. These were men trained to serve their country, to follow orders, to organize violence in pursuit of political objectives. When the country they had served ceased to exist, they faced impossible choices. Some continued fighting for the white cause until the bitter end, dying in battle or fleeing into exile. Others calculated that survival required accommodation with the new regime, that their skills gave them value, and that value might translate into safety. For a time, this calculation held. But in the end, the Soviet system proved that it valued ideological purity over military competence, that political reliability mattered more than professional skill, and that no amount of service could redeem a suspect past. The few who survived to achieve high rank, like Bagramyan and Govorov, did so by navigating an almost impossible path. They had to demonstrate absolute loyalty while carrying backgrounds that marked them as perpetually suspect. They had to excel militarily while avoiding any action that might be interpreted as politically questionable. They had to cultivate powerful patrons while remaining inconspicuous enough not to attract the attention of the security services. Their success was a testament to extraordinary ability, political acumen, and sheer luck. They were the exceptions that proved the rule. In Stalin's Soviet Union, former white officers were not to be trusted, and most would eventually pay with their lives. The long-term consequences of the purges extended far beyond the individual fates of the defectors. The decimation of the Red Army Officer Corps in the late 1930s left the Soviet military dangerously weakened precisely when it faced its greatest test. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Red Army was led by officers who often lacked experience and training. The veterans who had fought in the Civil War and who understood military operations at the operational and strategic levels were largely gone, executed in the purges or languishing in the Gulag. The result was a series of catastrophic defeats in the opening months of the war, with millions of Soviet soldiers killed, captured, or missing. The Soviet Union would eventually prevail, but at a cost in blood that might have been reduced if the military had not been gutted by Stalin's paranoia. The story of the white officers who defected to the Soviets is ultimately a story about the nature of revolutionary regimes and the price of political transformation. It demonstrates that such regimes, born in violence and sustained by coercion, cannot escape their origins. The Bolsheviks needed the expertise of their former enemies to survive the Civil War, but they could never truly accept those enemies as equals or comrades. The defectors were useful tools, to be employed when necessary and discarded when convenient. Their service was acknowledged when it was needed and forgotten when it became politically expedient to remember only their original opposition. This pattern would repeat throughout Soviet history. The regime would pragmatically utilize whoever and whatever it needed to survive and advance its goals, but it would never forget or forgive those whose backgrounds marked them as politically unreliable. The children of former nobles, the relatives of executed enemies, the members of suspect nationalities, and countless others would discover that the Soviet system maintained long memories and that past associations could be fatal decades after they seemed to have been forgotten. The white officers who defected during the Civil War were among the first to learn this lesson, but they would be far from the last.